The dying man's hand moved first, slow, trembling, streaked with blood from his shoulder to his wrist, but deliberate. Everyone in that trauma bay was shouting, and the monitors were screaming, and the charge nurse was pointing at the door and telling Claire Mercer to get out, to back up, to let the real clinicians work. And then the patient's eyes opened, not all the way, just enough. He turned his head 2 inches across the pillow, found her face in the chaos, and raised that broken hand in the specific, unmistakable angle of a military salute. Then he said 2 words no one in that room expected. If this is your first time here, you are watching a channel that tells stories medicine doesn't put in the news. Real pressure, real stakes. The kind of moments that happen in the middle of the night in trauma bays at malls and hallways and hospital parking lots when no one is supposed to be watching. Stories about people who were counted out and what happened when they refused to stay down. Subscribe right now so you don't miss what comes next. Hit the like button if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't bother to learn your name. And drop a comment with your city and your country. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels now. Let's go back to the night it started. Redstone Memorial Hospital sat at the edge of Caldwell, Nevada, close enough to the federal highway that you could hear the long-haul trucks downshifting through the double-pane windows on the 3rd floor. It was not a prestigious institution. It had no teaching affiliation that anyone bragged about at medical conferences, no research wing with a donor's name chiseled in marble above the entrance. What it had was a Level 2 trauma designation, a rotating cast of residents burning through their early years, and a charge nurse named Dana Fowler, who had run the night shift in the emergency and trauma wing for 11 years and treated that tenure like a land title. Claire Mercer had been at Redstone for 8 months. She was 30 years old, 5'6", with short brown hair she kept tucked behind her ears, and a way of moving through a hospital corridor that did not announce itself. She didn't rush, didn't make noise, didn't crowd into conversations that weren't hers. The other nurses had decided early on that she was simply quiet, probably shy, maybe not entirely cut out for the pace of a trauma floor. Dana had decided something more specific, that Claire was useful as a body but dangerous as an independent thinker, and had spent 8 months making sure those 2 categories stayed clearly separated. Claire's assignments never changed. Stock audits, supply room reconciliation, intake paperwork for the lower acuity patients that came through the south entrance. She pulled the overnight shifts on Tuesdays and Thursdays and the double on Sunday that nobody else wanted, and she showed up on time every single time, and she never complained. Not once, not out loud. Internally was a different matter, but Claire had learned a long time ago that you didn't win a fight by announcing your intentions. The resident who ran the trauma bay on nights was Dr. Marcus Hale, 29, ambitious, the specific brand of confident that develops when a person has been praised for intelligence their entire life without ever being truly tested by it. He had a medical degree from a school he mentioned within 60 seconds of every new conversation, a habit of hovering over nurses while they worked as if supervising a procedure he had personally designed, and a particular contempt for Claire that he had never bothered to justify with specifics. He called her the supply nurse to other residents. Settled something. The 2 of them, Dana and Marcus, had built something over the past 8 months. Not a friendship exactly, more of an alliance of convenience, the kind that forms between people who share a common interest in keeping certain arrangements intact. Dana controlled access to trauma assignments, procedure credits, and the documentation that went into personnel files. Marcus controlled which nurses got praised in rounds and which ones got flagged. Claire had been flagged twice in 4 months for vague infractions that read, on paper, like she had demonstrated poor clinical judgment. The first was for questioning a medication dosage in a chart she had not been assigned to. The second was for requesting a secondary assessment on a patient Marcus had cleared for discharge. The patient in the second case had come back by ambulance 6 hours later with a pulmonary embolism. The chart notation said the patient had declined follow-up recommendations. The notation had been added retroactively. Claire knew it. She had taken a photograph of the original entry with her personal phone 2 days before the patient returned, because by that point, she had developed a specific kind of institutional instinct that forms in people who have learned the hard way that paper disappears when it becomes inconvenient. She had not shown the photograph to anyone yet. She was waiting. The night of November 14th started the way most of Claire's nights started, with a supply audit in the south stockroom and the low-grade awareness that something in the air felt different. She couldn't have named it. She had learned not to trust that feeling too specifically. because sometimes it meant something, and sometimes it just meant she was tired and her nervous system had defaulted to its combat setting, which it still did occasionally, even 3 years out. She finished the audit at 11:20 p.m. and walked back toward the nursing station to log her count. She heard the bay doors open at 11:38, not the south doors. The main trauma entrance, the ones that swung wide on the hydraulic mechanism and stayed open for the gurneys that came in moving fast. Claire looked up from her workstation and saw the lights on the ambulance bay still flashing through the window. 2 paramedics. A third trauma team member she didn't recognize, wearing something that wasn't a paramedic uniform, darker, tactical, with a badge clipped at the waist that she couldn't read from across the room. And on the gurney, a man who was in serious trouble. She could see it from 40 feet. She didn't need to be in the bay. She could see it in the angle of his body, the way his left shoulder sat wrong, the specific stillness of his left chest, while his right side worked in rapid, compensatory heaves. Face was gray. His lips had the faint blue tinge that came with oxygen deprivation severe enough to show at distance. Dana was already moving toward the bay entrance, clipboard in hand, directing traffic with the authority of someone who had choreographed this 1,000 times. 2 other nurses followed. Marcus arrived from the direction of the resident lounge 30 seconds later, still pulling his white coat straight, the kind of practiced urgency that looked like competence if you weren't paying attention. Claire moved toward the bay. Mercer, Dana's voice. Flat, not a question. Claire stopped. Supply stock is low in bay 2. Handle that. His left chest isn't moving. Dana didn't look at her. I can see the patient, thank you. His SAT is probably in the low 80s. That's not a perfusion problem. That's Mercer. This time Dana turned. The look on her face was the specific one she had used 8 months of practice, perfecting not angry, which would have required acknowledging Claire as worth being angry at. It was dismissive, patient, the look you give a child who won't stop interrupting the adults. You are not assigned to this bay tonight. You are not on trauma rotation. This is a federal adjacent case with restricted access. Stand against the wall or take the supply assignment. Claire looked at the patient. His blood pressure was on the monitor now. 74/40 and falling. Stood against the wall. The bay became the specific kind of chaos that looks, from the outside, like organized activity. Marcus was directing orders. Dana was managing the team's positioning. 2 nurses moved with the kind of efficient obedience that comes from 11 months of Dana's influence, anticipating her preferences instead of reading the patient. Claire watched the monitor. The SAT came up on the screen. 79%. She watched Marcus reach for the wrong cart. He was thinking hemorrhage. He was setting up for a thoracic approach that would cost them 2 minutes minimum, and the patient did not have 2 minutes for the wrong approach. You could see his neck veins from the wall, distended. Not massively, but enough the specific, characteristic distension that came with pressure building in the wrong cavity. Tension pneumo, she said. No one responded. His attention pneumothorax. Sighed. You need to decompress before you do anything else. Marcus glanced at her. The look was brief and comprehensive. Nurse, if you don't remove yourself from this bay right now, I will have security called. His trachea is deviating. Look at his trachea. I'm looking at the patient. You're not, Claire said, and she said it in the specific voice she had not used in 3 years, the one that had nothing in it except the flat precision of a person who has made this call before and knows what happens when it isn't made fast enough. Trachea is deviated right. His left chest is not moving. He has JVD and his pressure is in the 70s. You have less than 90 seconds before he arrests. The attending physician, Dr. Sylvia Okafor, who had been hanging back while Marcus ran the initial response, stepped forward. She was the senior physician on tonight, a quiet woman with 22 years of emergency medicine and the specific professional patience that comes with having watched residents get things wrong enough times to know when to intervene. She looked at the patient's neck. She looked at the trachea. Something shifted in her face. Mercer, she said. What do you need? Dana said. Sylvia, she is not authorized. Dana. Dr. Okafor's voice was not loud. It carried the particular authority of someone who didn't need volume. What do you need? Claire was already moving. 14-gauge needle, 8 centimeters. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, left side. Someone handed her the needle. She didn't look up to see who. She located the landmarks in under 4 seconds, second rib, midclavicular line, top edge of the rib to avoid the neurovascular bundle, and she angled the needle and pushed. The sound was immediate. Air. A rush of it, the specific sound of a tension releasing. the pressure equalizing the way it was supposed to, the way it did not happen if you did the wrong thing. The blood pressure started climbing on the monitor. 89. The SAT began recovering. 82, 86, 91. The room was silent for 3 full seconds. Then Marcus said, "I was about to do that." Nobody responded to him. The patient's eyes opened. He was not all the way conscious. He was in the specific state that comes after a severe physiological crisis, aware enough to perceive, not stable enough to process. They found the ceiling, then the monitor, then the cluster of faces above him, and then they kept moving until they found Claire. He was probably 45, maybe older. The kind of face that had been weathered by something more demanding than ordinary life, with a jaw that had been broken at some point in the past and hadn't been set perfectly. His left arm was bandaged from the wrist to the shoulder. His right hand moved first. It moved slowly, with effort that was visible in the tendons of his wrist and the set of his jaw. He raised it approximately to chest height. It wasn't a full salute. He didn't have the strength for a full salute. But the angle was deliberate, and it was specific, and everyone in that room, who had ever stood in a formation, or watched a ceremony, or spent time near the military, knew exactly what it was. His lips moved. Claire leaned close enough to hear. "Good to see you again," he said, his voice barely above a breath. "Major Mercer." She straightened. The room was looking at her. Dana's face had done something complicated. Marcus had gone a specific, careful still. Claire looked at the patient. "Rest," she said. "You're stable." "Rest." He closed his eyes. Dr. Okafor said quietly, "Someone get chest tube equipment, and someone tell me who that man is." The answer came from the trauma bay entrance, not from anyone in the room, from the 2 people who had come through the door behind the paramedics and had been standing, silent and unobtrusive, against the far wall for the past 6 minutes. One of them held a federal identification that Claire recognized from a different life. "His name is Colonel Nate Riker," the taller one said. "United States Army Special Operations Command. And we'd like to know the same thing you would, Doctor. Who exactly is Major Mercer, and why isn't that on her personnel file?" Dana Fowler looked at Claire. For the first time in 8 months, the expression on Dana's face was not dismissal. It was something closer to the specific fear that sets in when a person realizes they have been playing a game against someone who was never actually playing. Claire didn't look at Dana. She looked at the monitor. Colonel Riker's blood pressure was holding at 104/68. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The next hour moved the way hospital hours always moved after a near miss, fast in the wrong places and impossibly slow in the ones that mattered. Riker was moved to the trauma ICU at 12:22 a.m. Doctor. Okafor stayed with him through the chest tube placement and the secondary assessment. Marcus hovered at the edge of the activity for 40 minutes and then disappeared in the direction of the resident lounge without being specifically asked to leave. Claire documented everything. That was the thing about her that Dana had never understood, despite 8 months of close proximity. Claire documented compulsively, not from anxiety, not from bureaucratic habit, but from a specific discipline she had developed during a period in her life that no one at Redstone Memorial knew anything about. She documented because she had learned, in circumstances considerably more consequential than a hospital shift, that the record was frequently the only thing that survived when everything else had been revised. She wrote the time of the decompression, the landmarks used, the blood pressure before and after, the oxygen saturation trajectory. She wrote the specific sequence of events in the bay, including the exchange with Dana about her assignment, and the exchange with Marcus about the procedure. She wrote it without editorializing, without characterizing anyone's motives, without using the kind of language that would look like an accusation rather than a clinical record. Facts, sequence, times. She was 3/4 through the documentation when Dana appeared at the workstation. "I need your charting," Dana said. "I'm still completing it. I need what you have." Claire looked up. "I'll submit it through the standard documentation system when it's complete." "That is the procedure, Dana." She held Dana's eyes. Not aggressively, steadily. "If you have a concern about my documentation, you can log it with administration the way you would for any other employee. Is there anything specific I can help you with tonight?" Dana stared at her for a long moment. There were things in that look: calculation, reassessment, the beginning of something that might have been alarm, but Dana was too practiced to let any of them land on her face long enough to be read clearly. She turned and walked away without another word. Claire turned back to the screen. She finished the documentation at 1:17 a.m. She saved 3 copies in 3 different locations, which was more than the system required, and which Dana, if she ever reviewed it, would have had no particular way to trace. Then Claire went back to the supply room and finished her audit, because that was still her job tonight. The two federal agents, she had learned their names by 2A. M, not from them, but from the conversation she overheard near the elevator. The kind of overheard conversation that happens in hospitals in the small hours when people stop accounting for who else is. In the hallway were Grant Merlot and Teresa Voss, and they had arrived at Redstone Memorial, not because of the explosion that had injured Riker, but because of something connected to it that was 3 levels above a hospital trauma event. Claire knew this the way she knew most things, not from a briefing or a direct communication, but from the accumulation of details that didn't fit the pattern of a standard federal escort. 2 agents for 1 patient was standard, but the equipment case that Voss had carried in and placed against the wall of the trauma bay, and which she had not opened, and which she had never left unattended, was not standard transport equipment. It was the kind of case that came with certain classifications, and Claire recognized it because she had signed 10 for similar cases on 3 separate occasions in a previous life. She didn't approach them. She wasn't ready to be approached. At 2:43 a.m., she passed the TICU entrance on her way back from the North Supply Station and glanced through the observation window. Riker was conscious, sitting up slightly, which was more than he should have been able to manage. But that matched what she remembered about him. He had been the kind of patient who would pull his own IV line if you left him unmonitored for 20 minutes. He was talking to Merlot. His hands moved when he talked, which meant he was well enough to be insistent about something. She didn't stop, but she had gone about 15 steps past the window when she heard the door open. Voss. The voice was neutral, not unfriendly, with the specific professional flatness of someone trained to read a room before they chose a register. Claire turned. "We'd like to talk to you," Voss said, "when you have a moment." "The colonel is asking." Claire looked at her watch. 2:44 a.m. "My shift ends at 7, she said. "He's not asking as a patient." "A beat," Claire said. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. I need to finish the log on the North Station supply count." No surprise on her face, just acknowledgement. "Take your time." Claire finished the log. She did not rush. The conversation with Riker lasted 41 minutes. Claire did not record it and was not asked to. Some of what was said in that room was not for any documentation system, and she had enough experience with that category of conversation to know the difference between what got written down and what got carried. What she could say afterward was that certain things had been confirmed. Things about her personnel file specifically, what was in it, and, more importantly, what wasn't. Things about the 6-page addendum that should have accompanied her application to Redstone Memorial, and which had, somewhere between the processing desk at her previous posting and the HR office at this hospital, ceased to exist. Things about Dana Fowler, whose history Riker knew in more detail than Claire would have expected, and which Merlot summarized in the flat. Precise language of someone reading from a file he had already read several times. Claire listened. She did not say much. At the end, Riker looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has been difficult and knows it, and is making a partial peace with the fact. "You saved my life," he said. "Twice now. I'm aware that I've been a difficult patient on both occasions." "You were," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Quite a smile. Something older than a smile. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Claire thought about it for a moment, not because she didn't know, but because the shape of what she was about to say mattered. She had learned that too, from a different context entirely. "I need the record to be accurate," she said. "That's all I've ever needed." Riker looked at Merlot. Merlot closed his notebook. Outside the TCU window, the Caldwell night was going gray at the edges. Another hour in the day shift would be arriving. Dana would brief the morning charge. Marcus would sign out to the day residents. The whole institutional machinery would turn over and reset, and Claire would walk out through the south entrance with her bag over one shoulder and her documentation filed and her audit logs complete, the same way she always left, quiet, unannounced, not bothering anyone. Except that this morning, for the first time in 8 months, the record of what had happened inside that trauma bay existed in more places than Dana Fowler knew about. And 2 federal agents were sitting in a hospital where they had not planned to linger, and a decorated military officer was awake and coherent and deeply, specifically interested in the contents of a personnel file that had been missing 6 pages since before Claire Mercer's had ever walked through the doors of Redstone Memorial Hospital. The morning shift began arriving at 6:45. Claire clocked out at 7:02. She walked to her car in the staff lot, got in, and sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular steadiness of a person who has been waiting for something to begin and has just recognized the specific sound of it starting. Started the car. She drove home. Behind her, every light in the trauma wing of Redstone Memorial was on. Behind her, every light in the trauma wing of Redstone Memorial was on, and by the time Claire pulled out of the staff lot, 2 of those lights belonged to offices that were not supposed to be occupied at 7 in the morning. She didn't know that yet. She found out 4 hours later when her phone rang, while she was still in bed, still in the specific half-sleep that comes after a night shift when your body is exhausted, but your nervous system hasn't gotten the message. The number was the hospital's main administrative line, which was unusual. Dana communicated through the shift management portal. HR communicated through email. The main line was for patients calling to confirm appointments, or for family members asking about visiting hours. Claire looked at it for 2 rings before she answered. Mercer. The voice on the other end was not Dana. It was Ellen Pruitt, the administrative coordinator for the chief nursing officer's office, and her voice had the careful neutrality of someone who had been told to make a call that she didn't particularly want to make. Dr. Hargrove would like to see you this afternoon. 2 o'clock if you're available. Dr. Sandra Hargrove was the chief nursing officer of Redstone Memorial. Claire had met her twice, once at the orientation 8 months ago, once in a hallway when Hargrove had been walking fast in the other direction. She was not in the habit of scheduling afternoon meetings with floor nurses. I'll be there, Claire said. She lay still for a moment after she hung up. Then she got up, showered, made coffee she didn't really taste, and sat at her kitchen table with her phone and pulled up the documentation system. Everything she had filed at 1:17 a.m. was there, intact, time-stamped. She checked the audit log the documentation system kept a feature that most nurses didn't think about, and confirmed that her files had been accessed once since she submitted them. The access timestamp was 5:51 a.m. The user ID was not Dana's. It was the hospital administrator's master account. She set her phone face down on the table and drank her coffee. She arrived at Hargrove's office at 1:52 p.m. and sat in the waiting area outside for 8 minutes before Ellen waved her in. The office was large by hospital standards, with a window that looked out over the west parking structure and a wall of bookshelves that had the slightly staged quality of bookshelves that exist to signal authority rather than to be used. Hargrove was at her desk, and she was not alone. Dana Fowler was in the chair to the left of the desk. Marcus Hale was standing near the window. Claire took the chair across from Hargrove without being asked. "Thank you for coming in on your off day," Hargrove said. She was 60-something, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the specific manner of an administrator who had spent her career managing disagreements between people who all believed they were right. "I want to discuss the events of last night." "Of course," Claire said. "Come to my attention that you performed an emergency procedure on the patient in Trauma Bay 1. Is that accurate?" "I performed a needle decompression." "Yes." Hargrove glanced at a paper on her desk. "You are listed on this shift's assignment log as supply rotation, not trauma." "That's correct." "Then can you explain why you inserted yourself into a federal adjacent trauma case that you were not assigned to?" Claire looked at her steadily. "Because the patient was approximately 60 seconds from cardiac arrest, and the attending physician had not yet initiated decompression." "Dr. Hale was managing the case," Dana said. Claire didn't look at Dana, kept her eyes on Hargrove. "Dr. Okafor asked me what I needed." Told her. "I performed the procedure with her verbal authorization. Patient's blood pressure recovered within 90 seconds of decompression. I documented the full sequence at 1:17 a.m., which you can verify through the system." "The procedure was outside your designated role," Marcus said from the window. His voice was measured, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite as controlled as he intended. "As a floor nurse on supply rotation, you don't have standing to make independent trauma decisions, regardless of what Dr. Okafor said in the moment. She was under pressure. Her authorization is documented," Claire said, "as is the sequence of the patient's vitals before and after. If anyone has a question about the clinical judgment involved, the numbers are in the chart." Marcus's jaw tightened. Hargrove set her pen down. "Nurse Mercer, I want to be direct with you. There are people in this room who believe last night's events constitute a protocol violation, serious enough to warrant a formal disciplinary action. I am trying to understand the full picture before I make any decisions." "I appreciate that," Claire said. Is there anything you want me to know that isn't in the chart? Claire thought about Riker's question from the night before. What do you need from me? She thought about Merlot's closed notebook. She thought about the master administrator account accessing her files at 5:51 a.m. I think the chart covers the clinical events accurately, she said. If you have questions about anything in my personnel file, I'd recommend requesting a complete copy, including any documentation that was part of my original application. I believe there may be pages missing. The room changed temperature by a small but measurable amount. Dana's expression did not move, but something behind it shifted, the way a wall shifts fractionally before a crack appears in plaster. Marcus looked at the window. Hargrove looked at Claire with the specific focus of a person hearing two conversations at once. We'll be in touch, she said. The formal write-up arrived through the system at 4:17 p. that same day. Claire read it at her kitchen table with a second cup of coffee that had gone cold. The language was careful, bureaucratic, assembled with the practiced neutrality of someone who had done this before. It cited the assignment discrepancy, the protocol for trauma bay access, and what it called unauthorized independent clinical decision-making. It did not use the word reckless, but the structure of the sentences pointed toward it. Recommended a suspension of trauma privileges, which Claire did not formally have, and a formal review of her clinical conduct over the preceding 8 months. 8 months, that was the specific time frame. Not 6, not 12. 8, which was how long she had been at Redstone Memorial, which meant the review would cover every shift she had ever worked there. She found that interesting. She wrote down the timestamp of the write-up, 4:17 p.m., and the name of the administrator who had processed it, which was not Hargrove's. It was a name she didn't recognize. Someone in mid-level HR, which told her the decision had been made at a level below Hargrove's office, which meant either Hargrove hadn't signed off on it or someone had moved faster than Hargrove intended. She photographed the write-up with her phone. Then she opened her email and drafted a message to the Nevada State Board of Nursing's documentation portal, requesting information on the formal process for submitting unsolicited clinical records in the context of a personnel dispute. She did not send it yet. She saved it as a draft and closed the app. She needed to think about timing. She went back to work 2 days later, Thursday night, and the shift was the kind of shift that exists to remind you that hospitals don't pause for institutional drama. 3 cardiac events between 8 p.m. and midnight. Pediatric respiratory case at 1 a.m. that resolved without incident but required 2 hours of monitoring. A domestic violence presentation at 3 a.m. that required a separate kind of attention entirely, the kind that didn't show up in vital signs. Dana was there, running the floor with the same practiced efficiency she always brought to nights. She didn't speak to Claire directly. She communicated through the shift log and through the charge board, the way you communicate with someone when you're building a case and you've decided that direct contact is a liability. Marcus wasn't on tonight. He was days now, which was a rotation change that had happened in the past 48 hours, and which Claire noted without reading too much into. 4:30 a.m., near the end of the shift, one of the other nurses, Jolene Park, a 3-year Redstone veteran who had always been professionally cordial without being warm, appeared beside Claire at the medication station. I heard about the write-up, Jolene said, keeping her voice below the ambient hum of the ward. It's in the system, Claire said. Marcus is telling the day shift residents you performed an unauthorized procedure, and Dana backed him up. A pause. People are saying, you might be out by next week. Claire pulled a medication tray and checked the labels. Possible. Jolene looked at her. You're not concerned. It wasn't a question exactly. It was the specific observation of someone who had expected a different reaction and was recalibrating. I'm concerned, Claire said. I'm just not panicking. Jolene was quiet for a moment. Then, in a lower register, 3 months ago, there was a case. Bed 11, the hip replacement that went wrong post-op. The attending signed off on a chart note he didn't write. I saw the original. I saw the revised version. Another pause, shorter. I didn't say anything because I didn't think anyone would believe me over a physician. Claire looked at her then, directly. Do you still have access to those dates? The system logs the revision history. Then keep a note of where to find it, Claire said. Somewhere that isn't the hospital system. Jolene looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small, tight nod and walked away. Claire finished the medication distribution. The letter from the Nevada State Nursing Board arrived digitally to the work email that the hospital monitored on the following Tuesday. Marcus had filed a formal complaint. The language of the complaint was precise and serious. It accused Claire of practicing outside her scope, performing an invasive procedure without physician authorization, and demonstrating a pattern of conduct that posed risk to patient safety. The phrase pattern of conduct was doing a specific kind of work in that sentence, and Claire recognized it immediately. It wasn't about the needle decompression. It was about the 8 months of documented incidents, the medication dosage flag, the discharge disagreement, the various write-ups, which, assembled together and narrated from a particular angle, told a story about a nurse with poor judgment and a habit of exceeding her boundaries. She had understood this was coming, not the specific mechanism, but the general direction. What she had not anticipated was the timing. The complaint had been filed the same day as the write-up, which meant Marcus hadn't waited to see how Hargrove's review developed. He had moved simultaneously, which told her he was either very confident or very frightened, and from what she knew of Marcus Hale, those two states were not always distinguishable from each other. Called the board's respondent line that afternoon and spent 47 minutes on hold before she reached a person. She took notes. She asked specific questions about the evidentiary process, about the timeline for preliminary review, about what documentation she could submit voluntarily in the early stages. Person on the other end was tired and slightly impatient, which meant they were real, and Claire trusted tired and slightly impatient over smooth and helpful every time. She didn't mention Riker. She didn't mention Merlot or Voss. She just gathered information. On Wednesday, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize, an Reno area code, and she almost let it go to voicemail before something made her answer. Miss Mercer. The voice was male, moderate in age, with the specific measured cadence of someone who spoke in professional contexts more than personal ones. My name is Paul Drennan. I'm a federal compliance auditor, currently working with a review team that has some interest in Redstone Memorial Hospital. I was given your name by Colonel Riker's case officer. Claire sat down. What kind of review? She asked. Kind that starts when a federal officer is admitted to a facility, and the facility's response raises questions about the integrity of its clinical documentation. A pause. I'm not in a position to give you details over an unsecured line, but I want you to know that the nursing board complaint that was filed against you has come to our attention. Okay, Claire said. I'd like to meet with you, somewhere neutral. Not the hospital. She thought about it for 3 seconds. There's a diner on Route 9 called Marta's. I can be there Thursday at noon. I know it, Drennan said. Thursday at noon. He ended the call. Claire looked at her phone for a moment after the call disconnected. Her hand was completely still. She noticed that and recognized it for what it was not calm. Exactly. The other thing. The thing that lived next to calm and sometimes got mistaken for it, but was actually the focused stillness of a person who has identified the situation and is now operating from the part of their brain that doesn't run on emotion. She had spent a long time cultivating that stillness. She hadn't always been grateful for the circumstances that had built it in her. The moment she was. Thursday arrived gray and cold, the kind of Nevada November that doesn't advertise itself the way desert cold usually does, but just settles in overnight and refuses to leave. Claire arrived at Marta's 12 minutes early, took a booth in the back corner with a sight line to the entrance, and ordered coffee she actually drank this time. Drennan arrived at 11:59. He was mid-50s, unremarkable in the specific way that certain professional people cultivate unremarkability, with a gray jacket and the kind of shoes that cost more than they looked like they did. He sat across from her and did not order anything. The audit started 48 hours after Riker's admission, he said, without preamble. It was triggered independently of your situation. But once we pulled the admissions documentation for the night in question, your personnel file became relevant. Because of the missing pages, Claire said. He looked at her steadily. You knew about them before last week, I suspected. I didn't have confirmation until the colonel's team confirmed it. Drennan set a folder on the table. He didn't open it. I'm going to tell you what we found, and then I'm going to ask you what you have, and then we're going to figure out what happens next. Acceptable? Yes. Your original application to Redstone Memorial included a 6-page military service addendum. It documented your rank at separation, your deployment history, your training certifications, and 3 commendations for combat medical performance. None of those 6 pages exist in Redstone Memorial's HR system. The digital upload log shows they were received. It also shows they were deleted. The deletion occurred 8 days after your application was processed, and 4 days before your hire was confirmed. Claire kept her face neutral. She had suspected the deletion. Knowing the timeline was different from suspecting it. and she felt the difference somewhere in her chest as a thing she didn't have a word for. The account that deleted the files, she said, is associated with an HR coordinator who no longer works at the hospital. She left voluntarily 7 months ago. He paused. We found a payment in her personal account that doesn't correspond to any Redstone payroll record, dated 5 days before the deletion. The diner was quiet. 2 other tables, both occupied by people who were demonstrably not paying attention to anything other than their own conversations. Dana Fowler, Claire said. Drennan didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. He just moved to the next thing. In the past 8 months, your clinical record at Redstone shows 11 documented incidents. 9 of them follow a pattern. You identified a clinical concern, escalated through appropriate channels, and were overridden. 6 of those 9 cases. The patient outcome was subsequently complicated readmissions, secondary diagnoses, 1 death. The Garfield patient, Claire said immediately. The name had stayed with her. Bernard Garfield, 72, readmitted 72 hours after discharge, with an acute MI following a cardiology clearance that we believe was influenced by documentation that wasn't accurate. Drennan paused. He didn't survive the second admission. Claire looked at the table for a moment. Not long. She brought her eyes back up. I flagged the discharge, she said. I have the original chart entry showing my concern. I also have a photograph of the revised version that appeared after he was readmitted. Drennan's expression didn't change, but his stillness became a different quality of still. Photograph, he said, taken on my personal phone, time-stamped, before the revision. She looked at him levelly. I have several like it. He was quiet for 4 full seconds. Mercer, he said, I need to be honest with you. The nursing board complaint that was filed against you is not going to be easy to dismiss. It's been constructed carefully, and the documentation behind it has been assembled over 8 months. Even with the audit in progress, the board operates on its own timeline. I know, she said. Your license could be at risk for several months, regardless of what we find. I know that too. And you're telling me you have time-stamped photographic evidence of document alteration in at least 1 patient death case. I'm telling you I have several photographs of several documents, and I know where the system's revision logs are. And I have a colleague who observed at least 1 additional instance and can identify the access timestamps. She paused. I'm also telling you that I'd like to give you all of it, formally, through whatever channel creates the most durable record. Not because I'm looking for something in return, because the record matters. Garfield's family deserves the record. Drennan looked at her for a long moment. Colonel Riker said you'd say something like that, he said. How is he? She asked. Recovering. Irritable. Asking about you more than his attending would prefer. Something moved at the corner of Drennan's mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile if he'd let it get there. He also said, and I'm quoting, that you were the most controlled person he'd ever seen operate under pressure, which is a significant statement coming from him. He was a difficult patient, Claire said, both times. Drennan finally opened the folder. Here's what I need from you, he said. They were at Marta's for 2 hours and 11 minutes. When Claire left, she sat in her car in the parking lot for a moment, not from hesitation, but from the practical reality that she needed to organize what had just happened before she drove anywhere. Drennan's team had been building the audit from the institutional side financial records, documentation logsies. What they hadn't had was the clinical thread, the patient-level evidence that connected the documentation manipulation to specific harm. That was the gap between a healthcare administration fraud case and something more serious. Claire had just handed them the clinical thread. She has also, in doing so, formally become a federal witness in an investigation that was considerably larger than a nursing board complaint filed by a third-year resident who was frightened about his career. She was not certain how Dana would respond when she found out. And Dana would find out, probably through channels Claire couldn't predict, because Dana had spent 11 years building a network inside that hospital that functioned like a set of tripwires. Federal auditors asking questions about documentation logs were not subtle. Claire started the car. She needed to be careful about the next few days. Not paranoid was a liability, but careful. Careful was a tool. She had been careful for 8 months without any particular objective in mind, except survival and the preservation of the record. Now the record had a direction. That changed the geometry of careful. She got home at 3:14 p.m. and checked her email. There was a message from Hargrove's office. Not from Ellen this time, directly from Hargrove's official account, which meant Hargrove had sent it herself. It was brief, 2 sentences requesting a meeting first thing Friday morning. The subject line read, "Personnel matter urgent." Claire read it twice. Then she looked at the timestamp. The email had been sent at 2:47 p.m. She had left Marta's at 2:31 p.m., 16 minutes. She sat with that for a moment. Drennan's people were careful and professional and operated through official channels. They would not have contacted the hospital in 16 minutes, which meant someone else had reported the meeting, which meant someone had been watching the diner, or watching Claire's car, or had access to something Claire didn't know about yet. She looked at the email again. Personnel matter urgent. She thought about Jolene, who had said people are saying you might be out by next week. Thought about Marcus, who had filed the nursing board complaint the same day as the write-up. She thought about the HR coordinator, who had deleted 6 pages from her file and then left the hospital voluntarily 7 months ago with a payment that had no payroll record behind it. She thought about how many of these pieces she had been collecting quietly, in photographs and system logs and handwritten timestamps, for 8 months without knowing precisely what they would build into. She was starting to know. She replied to Hargrove's email. Friday morning works. What time? The response came back in 4 minutes 7:00 a.m. Please bring any documentation related to your clinical work over the past 8 months. Claire read that sentence 3 times. Any documentation. Not the documentation we've identified. Not specific records. Any. Which meant either Hargrove didn't know what Claire had, or Hargrove knew exactly what Claire had and wanted to see whether she'd bring it voluntarily. She thought about Hargrove's face in that meeting 2 days ago, the specific quality of attention she had given to Claire's comment about the missing pages. The way she had said, "We'll be in touch," without looking at Dana. Claire closed the email and opened the photograph folder on her phone. 43 images. She began organizing them by date. She was halfway through when her phone rang. An unknown number, different from Drennan's. Nevada area code, but not Reno. Closer local, she answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize, female, low, rapid. "Don't go to that meeting Friday. They're planning to hand you your termination and use the meeting itself as the formal notification. Dana's already cleared it with the board liaison. You'll be out before the audit has time to surface anything." The line went dead. Claire sat completely still. Outside her window, the late afternoon light was failing, the particular Nevada dusk that went from orange to gray without much transition. And in that light, her apartment parking lot looked exactly the same as it always did. She didn't recognize the voice. She had no way to verify anything the caller had said. Call could have been exactly what it sounded like, someone warning her. Could have been the opposite, a way to get her to skip the meeting, to create an absence that could be characterized as insubordination and used against her. She set the phone down on the table. She picked up her pen and wrote down the time of the call, the area code prefix, and the precise wording of what had been said, word for word, from memory, because memory degraded and the written record didn't. And she had learned that lesson in circumstances where forgetting had consequences measured in something heavier than professional consequences. Then she kept organizing the photographs. She would go to the meeting. She would bring the documentation. What she would not do was walk in unprepared, and what she had just realized, sitting in her apartment at 3:41 p.m. with 43 photographs and a federal auditor's business card, and a handwritten timestamp of an anonymous tip, was that the people who had spent 8 months building a case against her had accidentally given her something they could not take back. They had given her time, 8 months of it, and she had used every single day. She went to the meeting. She arrived at Hargrove's office at 6:54 a.m., 6 minutes early, which was a choice and not a habit. She was wearing clean scrubs and her hospital badge, and she had her bag over one shoulder with a folder inside it, and she sat in the chair outside Ellen Pruitt's desk and waited with her hands in her lap and her breathing deliberate and slow, specific respiratory pattern she had learned in a context that had nothing to do with hospitals. Ellen didn't make eye contact. That was informative. At 7:03, the door opened. Hargrove was at her desk. Dana was in the chair to the left again, same position as Wednesday, like she had assigned herself a fixed coordinate in this room. There was a third person. Claire hadn't met a man in his 40s with a legal pad and the particular stillness of someone present in an official capacity. He introduced himself as Warren Silk from the hospital's legal and compliance office. Claire sat. Silk did most of the talking. It was, as the anonymous caller had said it would be, a termination. The language was careful and layered, but the architecture was clear. The nursing board complaint created a liability question. The protocol violations created a documentation problem, and the hospital's position was that Claire's continued employment created institutional risk that the board of directors was not willing to carry. Her last paid day would be today. Her access credentials would be deactivated at the end of the meeting. She was welcome to collect personal items from her locker with an escort. He said all of it in a measured, moderately sympathetic register that was entirely professional and entirely bloodless. When he finished, Hargrove looked at Claire for the first time since the meeting had started. "Do you have any questions?" Hargrove asked. "Yes," Claire said. She reached into her bag and set the folder on the desk. "Before we finalize anything, I want to make sure you have complete information." Silk's expression shifted slightly. "Ms. Mercer, this is a final notification, not a negotiation." "I understand that." She opened the folder. The first document is a time-stamped photograph of the original chart entry for Bernard Garfield, taken 4 days before his second admission. The second is a photograph of the revised entry, taken after his death. The revision timestamp in the hospital system is recoverable. I can direct your IT department to the exact log location. The third document is a list of 11 clinical incidents from my 8 months here, with corresponding patient outcomes and the names of the physicians who overrode my assessments. Those patients had adverse outcomes after the overrides. Nobody moved. The fourth item is not in this folder, she continued. It's a formal evidentiary submission I filed yesterday afternoon, with the compliance review team conducting the federal audit currently underway at this hospital. The submission includes 43 photographs and a written account of the events of November 14th, with timestamps. It also includes the name of a colleague who can testify to an additional case of documentation alteration that she personally observed. She closed the folder and left it on the desk. I want to make sure that when this hospital makes its decision about my employment, it's making it with complete information, not partial information assembled by people who had a reason to select what you saw. The room was quiet. Silk looked at Dana. Dana did not look back at him. Hargrove looked at the folder. "Warren," Hargrove said, in a voice that was several degrees cooler than the one she'd been using all morning. "Could you give us a few minutes?" He didn't look pleased about it. The three of them sat Hargrove, Dana, Claire, in the particular silence of a room where the conversation that needs to happen is not the one that was planned. "You filed with the federal audit team," Hargrove said. Question. "Yesterday afternoon." Hargrove took her reading glasses off her forehead and set them on the desk. She looked tired in the way that people look when they've been sustaining something effortful for longer than they wanted to. "How long have you been building this?" 8 months, Claire said. "I didn't start with a plan. I started because I didn't trust what I was seeing, and I didn't want to lose the record of it." Hargrove looked at Dana. Dana's face was a controlled surface. Whatever was happening behind it was not visible. But her hands, Claire noticed, were flat on her thighs in the specific way of someone who has decided very deliberately not to let them move. Hargrove said, "Is there anything you want to say right now?" "I want legal present before I say anything." Hargrove held her gaze for a moment. Then she said evenly, "That's probably wise." She looked back at Claire. "I need to suspend this meeting. The termination is on hold pending further review. Your access credentials will remain active. I'd ask you not to discuss this with other staff until we've had a chance to." "I won't," Claire said. "I'd also ask that any documentation related to my personnel file be preserved in its current state. I'm aware that the file has already been altered once. I'd like that not to happen again." Something moved across Hargrove's face. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was the expression of a person hearing something they should have asked about months ago and understanding, fully and uncomfortably, that they didn't. "It won't," Hargrove said. Claire picked up her bag. "I'm on shift tonight," she said. "I'll be here at 7. She left the folder on the desk. The day passed in the specific slow-motion way of days when something large is in motion and you can't see all of it. Claire went home, slept for 4 hours, woke up without an alarm. She made food she didn't remember eating afterward. She checked her phone twice, once for messages from Drennan, which hadn't come yet, and once to confirm that her access credentials were still active, which they were. 5:30 p.m. she got a text from Jolene, no message. Just a period, which was a thing Jolene had apparently decided, was a discreet way of communicating "I'm aware, something is happening, and I'm still in." Claire responded with a period of her own and put the phone in her pocket. She drove to Redstone Memorial and arrived at 6:48 p. The night shift began the way night shifts always began, handoff from days, assignment board, the particular orchestration of bodies and tasks that happened in the first 20 minutes before the floor found its rhythm. Dana was not on tonight. Her name wasn't on the board. Different charge nurse Phil Osei, who was experienced and straightforward and had never once spoken to Claire with anything other than professional neutrality, was running the floor. Claire took her assignment. Supply rotation again, South Stockroom. She didn't comment on it. She was halfway through the supply audit at 9:15 p.m. when Marcus Hale walked into the stockroom. She knew his footsteps by now, the specific rhythm of someone who moved with the assumption that rooms rearranged themselves around his arrival. She heard them in the corridor before the door opened, which gave her 3 seconds to decide on her posture, and she decided on the one she always defaulted to, still working, facing the shelf. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I'm in the middle of an audit," she said. "I don't care." She turned. He was in his white coat, which meant he was between patients, which meant this was deliberate. He had come here on purpose at 9:15 on a Thursday night to find her in the stockroom. He looked different than he had on Wednesday morning. Not unprofessional, but thinner around the edges, maybe. Specific quality of someone who had been sleeping badly. "Complaint," he said. "I need to know what you've submitted to the audit team." "I'm not going to discuss that with you, Claire." He almost never used her name. The fact that he did now told her something about his current state that his face was working to conceal. "I filed that complaint because Dana told me it was the only way to protect the department from the liability you'd created. I didn't. I wasn't aware of all the details of what had happened with your file." "Which details specifically?" "The credential pages. The deletion." "Are you telling me you filed a nursing board complaint accusing me of practicing outside my scope?" she said, keeping her voice level, without knowing that the documentation establishing my scope had been deliberately removed from my personnel file. He didn't answer immediately. "Dana said you had no trauma qualifications. She said the military background was something you'd exaggerated on your application and that HR had flagged it. She said the deletion was standard processing for unverified credentials. And you believed her." "I had no reason not to." The stockroom was quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor alarmed briefly and then stopped. "Marcus," she said, "you had every reason. You watched a nurse perform a successful emergency decompression on a patient who was 60 seconds from arrest. You watched his blood pressure recover in real time. And then, instead of asking any question about who nurse was or what she knew, you filed a complaint against her the same day. That wasn't because Donna told you to. That was because you needed the narrative to go in a direction that protected your version of what happened in that bay." She paused. "I'm not interested in your reasons. I'm interested in the record. And the record is already in the hands of people who are going to read it very carefully." He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you want?" he said. "Nothing from you," she said. "I want what I've always wanted. An accurate record." She turned back to the shelf. "You should talk to an attorney. I mean that genuinely. You're going to need one." He stood there for another few seconds. Then he left. She finished the audit. Drennan called at 11:40 p.m. She stepped into the stairwell to take it, the only reliably private space in a working hospital. "We executed a document preservation order on Redstone Memorial's HR and clinical systems at 6 o'clock this evening," he said. "They can't delete or alter anything now without triggering a federal obstruction issue. I wanted you to know." "What triggered the timing?" she asked. "An access attempt on your personnel file at 5:17 p.m. from an account that had no current administrative reason to be in that file. The access was blocked by the preservation protocol, which had gone live 9 minutes earlier. 5:17. She had left Hargrove's office that morning. Hargrove had told Dana she'd be wise to have legal present. Dana had gone somewhere, and at some point during that day, she or someone connected to her had tried to get back into Claire's file. "Account," Claire said. "Not Dana's direct account. A secondary account. We're tracing the connection." A pause. "There's something else. We ran Bernard Garfield's case through our clinical review team. Your photograph of the original chart entry matches what the system's own deleted file cache shows. The revision was made from an account belonging to a physician who was not Garfield's attending and had no documented reason to be in his chart." Claire stood in the stairwell. The concrete walls were cold. A floor below her, something mechanical was running in the building's service infrastructure. A low, constant hum. "Marcus Hale," she said. "We're not confirming names yet." "I understand. What I can tell you," Drennan said, "is that what started as a documentation fraud case has become something that involves at minimum one patient death with a potentially altered record, credential falsification scheme that targeted a specific employee, and a filing with the state nursing board that may have been made using knowingly false information. The scope of this is larger than the original audit parameters. How much larger? She asked. A beat. We're looking at 41 cases over the past 3 years. Your 9 are inside that number. We think there are other nurses and residents whose work was misattributed. We think there's a billing component procedures being credited to attending physicians who didn't perform them, which has insurance and Medicare implications. 41. She had heard that number before, from Riker's team in the TCU, but in the abstract. Hearing it now with Garfield's case attached to it, and the stairwell cold around her, it landed differently. What do you need from me going forward? She asked. We'd like you to remain at the hospital for now, in your current role. We're going to be bringing in an additional review team in the next few days, and we don't want anything to change in the environment before they arrive. And Mercer, he paused. The nursing board complaint, we've been in contact with the board's investigative office. We've flagged the complaint as potentially originating from falsified information. That doesn't stop their process, but it puts them on notice. It may be several months before it formally resolves. I know, she said. That's a real liability. Your license is technically under review for the duration. I know that too. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly, still professional, but with something underneath it that was closer to direct. Colonel Riker asked about you this morning. He's been moved to a rehabilitation facility in Reno. He wanted me to tell you, and I'm quoting again because he was specific about the wording that the record exists, that it will survive, and that the people trying to erase it should have considered who they were erasing it from. Claire leaned against the concrete wall. Tell him I said he's still a difficult patient. She went back to the floor and finished the shift. At 3 a.m., 2 things happened within 9 minutes of each other, and the specific proximity of those 2 things was the kind of coincidence that stopped being coincidence once you understood the shape of what was moving. First was a call to Phil Osee from the night administrator, routed through the nursing station. Phil took it in the break room with the door closed. He was in there for 6 minutes. When he came out, his face was arranged carefully. I need you to come with me, he told Claire. She followed him to the nursing station. Sitting across the counter, in the waiting area that was usually occupied by anxious family members, was a woman Claire had never seen. Late 50s, civilian clothes, with a badge on a lanyard that she had turned face down, but that had the particular format of a state-issued credential. She looked up when Claire approached. Nurse Mercer, she said. I'm Dr. Anita Cowell, from the Nevada Division of Healthcare Quality. I've been authorized to conduct a preliminary site assessment in connection with an active compliance review. I'd like to ask you some questions, if you have a few minutes. Claire looked at Phil. Phil looked back at her with the expression of a man who had been told something in a 6-minute phone call that he was still processing. Of course, Claire said. She sat. Cowell had a tablet and a stylus, and she was recording the conversation, which she disclosed immediately and clearly, and which Claire appreciated for its directness. Questions were specific and clinical procedure protocols, documentation practices, chain of authorization for emergency interventions, standard assessment language. But beneath the standard language was a specific thread. She kept returning to the question of how clinical credit was assigned, who signed off on procedures, and what the process was when a nurse identified a concern that a physician overrode. Claire answered everything. She was 15 minutes into the conversation when the second thing happened. Phil appeared at her elbow, quieter than she'd seen him move. Claire, he said low. Dana Fowler just badged into the building. Claire looked at the clock. 3:17 a.m. Dana was not on shift. Dana had not been on tonight's schedule. The building was accessible to credentialed staff at all hours, but Dana coming in at 3:17 a.m. on a night she wasn't working. The night after a termination meeting had been suspended and a federal preservation order had gone live, was not a visit for any legitimate clinical purpose. Cowell had heard Phil. She was watching Claire's face. Where did she badge in? Claire asked. South entrance. She's moving toward administration. Cowell stood. She was on her phone before she fully had her balance, speaking quietly and quickly, and whatever she said into it produced a response in under 30 seconds. Because a minute later, 2 people who had not been in the building before were coming through the main entrance with their own credentials in hand. Nurse Mercer, Cowell said. Please stay here. Claire stayed. She sat in the plastic waiting chair, and she watched the clock, and she did not fidget, which was not the same as not feeling anything. She felt it. the specific coiled alertness of a situation, moving past the point where her individual documentation and her 43 photographs and her federal audit contacts were the primary engine of events. Something had shifted in the last 40 minutes. The investigation had crossed from a gathering phase into something active, and Dana walking into the building at 3:17 a.m. with a preservation order on the hospital's systems was either a catastrophic error in judgment or a sign that Dana was acting on information that she believed changed her options. Neither interpretation was good for Dana. Phil sat down next to Claire without being asked. "What's happening?" he said. "An accurate record is getting made," Claire said. Looked at her sideways. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." They sat. At 3:41 a.m., Cowell came back. She was followed by one of the people who had come through the main entrance, a man Claire didn't know, and by Hargrove, who was in civilian clothes and looked like she had been called from home and had dressed in the dark. Hargrove's face was doing something complicated, not frightened, but the expression of someone who has been watching a situation develop and has just received confirmation that it has developed further and faster than she calculated. "Where is Dana now?" Claire asked. Cowell said secured. The word landed in the waiting area like a stone, dropped in still water. Hargrove looked at Claire. For a long moment she didn't say anything. There was something in her face that might have been an apology, working its way toward the surface. But Hargrove was the kind of person who had spent a career managing things before they became visible. And even now, in civilian clothes, at 3:41 in the morning in her own hospital, that instinct was still operating. "She went to your personnel file," Hargrove said. "The physical file. Paper backup in the administration records room. The digital system was locked, but the paper file wasn't covered by the digital preservation order," Claire said. "Paper file had already been accessed," Hargrove said, "before she got there. By me. At 9 this morning." She looked at Claire steadily. "Pulled it after our meeting. I wanted to see it myself." She paused. The gaps were visible, where pages had been removed. The binding holes were there without the pages. Another pause, longer. "I should have looked 8 months ago. The waiting area was quiet." "Yes," Claire said. "You should have." Hargrove absorbed that without deflection. 3:58 a.m., Marcus Hale arrived. Not walking, he was being walked, which was different. Federal agent on either side, and his white coat still on, and his face the specific pale of a person who has just understood in full and irreversible terms that the situation he was in was not one he could manage his way out of. He didn't look at Claire as they walked him past the nursing station. Phil said quietly, "I've worked here 9 years. I've never seen anything like this." "I know," Claire said. 4:22 a.m. Drennan arrived in person for the first time since the diner. He was in the same gray jacket, which made her think he either had several of them or hadn't been home. He stopped at the nursing station and looked at her with the expression of someone who has been coordinating something complex from a distance and is now making a direct assessment. "The paper file," he said. "I know," she said. She was attempting to destroy the physical record of the credential deletion. The paper file had notations in it handwritten that connected the deletion to a specific instruction. Written instruction. Claire looked at him. "From whom?" she said. Drennan looked at her for a moment. "That," he said, "is what's going to make this significantly larger than any of us anticipated when this week started." Phil had gone quiet beside her, sensing that he was now adjacent to something that was beyond a hospital administration matter, beyond a documentation fraud, beyond anything that had a clean institutional name. "How much larger?" Claire said. Drennan looked at the corridor where Marcus had been walked 24 minutes ago, then back at her. "The handwritten instruction in Dana Fowler's paper file," he said, "has a signature on it. The signature belongs to someone who is not employed by Redstone Memorial Hospital and has never been employed by Redstone Memorial Hospital." He paused. "Someone with a financial relationship to the hospital's primary equipment and pharmaceutical vendor, which has been under separate federal scrutiny for the past 14 months for procurement irregularities connected to 3 Department of Defense contracts." Claire's stillness became a different kind of still. She thought of Riker, of the explosion, of the tactical equipment case Voss had never opened and never left unattended, of the way Drennan had said the scope of this is larger than the original audit parameters in the STA 3 hours ago, and how she had understood that to mean the hospital, and was only now understanding that the hospital was not the largest shape in this. "The vendor," she said. Drennan didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. "I need you to be available tomorrow," he said. "The hospital, at the federal field office in Reno." There are people who need to talk to you about Colonel Riker's case and about what you observed in the trauma bay, the 43 photographs, and everything you know about the sequence of events from the night of November 14th. I'll be there, she said. And Mercer, he stopped. What's in those photographs and what's in that paper file? Together, it's going to take time. The nursing board process is going to take time. I want you to understand that going in. People involved in this are going to fight it, and fighting it is going to be slow. And it's going to look, for a period of time, nothing is resolving. That's the nature of what this has become. I understand, she said. You might lose your license before you get it back. I might, she said. He looked at her. You're not going to tell me you're fine with that. I'm not fine with it. It's my license. 8 years of work, and a career I chose specifically and deliberately. She looked at him steadily. But the record matters more. The Garfield family deserves the record. The other 40 patients deserve the record. That doesn't change what it costs me. Just means the cost is worth it. Drennan looked at her for a long moment. Then he gave a small nod that was not the bureaucratic nod of a federal auditor, but something more personal, something that acknowledged what she'd said without performing anything about it. 7 a.m., he said. Reno field office. He walked toward the administration wing. Claire looked at Phil. Phil was looking at her with an expression she didn't have an immediate category for. It wasn't awe. He was too practical for awe. It was closer to the expression of someone recalibrating the size of something they thought they had measured correctly. Are you staying for the rest of shift? He asked. Yes, she said. I've got supply audit in the north wing. She picked up her clipboard. She was halfway down the corridor when her phone vibrated. Text from a number she now recognized as Jolene's. They just told me to come in for a statement. Tomorrow morning. Is this what I think it is? Claire typed back. Yes. Be honest. Bring the dates you remember. She put the phone in her pocket and kept walking. The North Wing supply room was cold and fluorescently lit, and smelled like every hospital supply room in the world. And she worked through the audit methodically, item by item, the way she had done every shift for 8 months. And when she found a discrepancy in the IV supply count, she documented it precisely and submitted the correction through the proper channel, because that was the job. And the job didn't pause for the magnitude of what was happening 2 floors up in the administration wing, where federal agents were photographing a piece of paper with a signature on it that was about to connect a hospital documentation fraud to a Department of Defense procurement case that had been running for 14 months. Finished the audit at 5:48 a.m. She submitted the count. She sat for a moment on the supply room floor, with her back against the metal shelving, and her knees up and her hands resting on them. Not from exhaustion exactly, but from the need for 30 seconds of stillness that wasn't performed and wasn't for anyone. Scar on her left forearm caught the fluorescent light. She had stopped noticing it most of the time. She noticed it now. She stood up. She had an audit in the south wing before shift change, and 2 floors above her at 5:51 a.m. A federal agent photographing the contents of a paper personnel file turned to the second page of a handwritten instruction memo and found, beneath the signature she had already documented, a second name, a name that was not on any Redstone Memorial employee roster, not connected to any vendor filing, not in any of the 41 case files that Drennan's team had spent 2 weeks assembling, a name that appeared in exactly one other document in the entire federal case file. Personnel record of Colonel Nate Riker. The name was Victor Alden, agent who founded a woman named Reyes, who had been with Drennan's team for 11 months. And had developed the specific professional caution of someone who had learned not to react visibly to things she found in documents, photographed the page twice, logged the timestamp, and then stepped into the corridor and called Drennan on his cell phone rather than the team radio. Drennan was in the administration wing conference room when he took the call. He listened for 40 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "Lock the file room. Nobody in or out until I get there," and ended the call and walked quickly enough that the 2 junior agents in the conference room looked up from their laptops and then at each other. Claire didn't know any of this yet. She was finishing the South Wing audit at 6:10 a.m., moving through the supply count with the mechanical steadiness of someone operating on 4 hours of sleep and adrenaline that had burned down to its residue. The day shift would start arriving in 40 minutes. The hospital would reset and recalibrate the way it always did at 7. The particular institutional metabolism of shift change, and whatever was happening in the administration wing would be absorbed into the background noise of a working facility, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. She submitted the south wing count at 6:23 and walked back toward the nursing station to clock out. Phil was still there. He should have been preparing handoff, but he was standing at the station with his arms crossed and a look on his face that she had not seen from him before. Not alarmed exactly, but the look of someone monitoring multiple things simultaneously and not being fully satisfied by any of them. Drennan's team sealed the records room, he said quietly when she reached him. 20 minutes ago. Nobody will tell me why. Something in the paper file, she said. Something new? Something they didn't expect. She clocked out. I'm going to Reno this morning. Federal Field Office. Phil looked at her. What do you need before you go? The question surprised her, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple and direct, and she hadn't anticipated it. Phil Sosi had worked 9 years at Redstone Memorial, survived 3 administration changes and 2 accreditation reviews, and 11 years of Dana Fowler's particular style of institutional control, and he had navigated all of it by being competent and neutral and professionally invisible in the specific way of people who understand that survival in certain environments requires not being a target. He was making himself a target right now by asking that question in that way, and he knew it, and he was asking anyway. Witness log, she said. If anyone asks you about tonight's events before I'm back, document the exact time, exact wording, and the name of whoever's asking. Don't answer substantively without legal counsels present. He nodded once. Done. She picked up her bag. And Phil, you ran a clean floor tonight. Whatever happens, that's on record. He didn't respond to that. He just gave her the specific nod of someone who has heard a thing and is going to carry it without making a ceremony of it. The drive to Reno was 90 minutes on a clear morning, the kind of Nevada highway that gave you nothing to look at except distance and sky, which was not an unpleasant thing when you needed to think. Claire drove the speed limit and kept the radio off and used the 90 minutes the way she used most empty time, not to stop thinking, but to let the thinking arrange itself without interference. Victor Alden. She knew the name. She had known it before Drennan's call, before the field agents arrived, before the paper file was sealed. She had not said so to Drennan because the specific way she knew it was not the kind of thing you put into a phone conversation in a hospital stairwell, and also because she had needed time to understand what it meant that his name was in Dana's file. Victor Alden was the regional director of operations for Corvus Medical Group, a healthcare supply and pharmaceutical distribution company that held contracts with 14 hospitals across Nevada and Arizona, and as of 3 years ago, had expanded into Department of Defense procurement for medical supplies at 2 military installations. She knew his name because she had processed his company's supply invoices for 8 months. Corvus was Redstone Memorial's primary vendor, and part of the supply rotation job that Dana had assigned her included reconciling the incoming invoices against the stockroom count. She had noticed 6 months ago a pattern in the invoices that she hadn't been able to fully explain. Quantities billed did not consistently match quantities received. The discrepancies were small, the kind of small that disappears in the noise of a large institution's supply chain if no one is specifically looking for it. But Claire had been looking, because looking carefully at things that didn't quite add up was a habit she couldn't turn off, and she had documented the discrepancies in a personal log she kept in a notebook at home, not in the hospital system, because by 6 months in, she had understood enough about the environment she was working in to know that the hospital system was not a safe place to keep observations you didn't want to disappear. The notebook was in her bag right now. She had added Alden's name to it 4 months ago, when she'd found his direct contact information, printed on a Corvus invoice in a format that didn't match the standard vendor template. It had looked, at the time, like an administrative irregularity. It looked different now. She reached the Reno Federal Field Office at 8:19 and sat in the lobby for 11 minutes before Drennan came to get her himself, which was different from the protocol of the morning. When she'd arrived Thursday at Marta's, he'd been there first. The fact that he was coming from somewhere else told her the morning had been active. Face confirmed it. He took her to a conference room on the 3rd floor. There were 4 other people in the room, Reyes, 2 agents she hadn't met, and a woman in her 60s with the specific bearing of someone who held a rank that didn't need to be announced. She was introduced as Deputy Director Marlowe, and she shook Claire's hand with the directness of someone who didn't use handshakes to perform anything. "We've been briefed on your involvement," Marlowe's said. "We'd like to start with what you know about Victor Alden." Claire set her bag on the table and took out the notebook. The debrief lasted 4 hours and 19 minutes. Claire had a cup of coffee at the start, and another one 2 hours in, and she answered every question with the same method she had been using for 8 months. Sequential, specific, source-referenced, nothing inferred beyond what the documentation supported. She walked them through the invoice discrepancies. She gave them the notebook. She identified the specific invoices by date and reference number, which she had memorized not as a deliberate act, but because her memory for numbers under pressure was something that had been useful in contexts that no longer applied to her daily life and which she had stopped trying to suppress. The two agents she hadn't met turned out to be from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, which told her the shape of what she had been adjacent to for 8 months without knowing it. They were interested in the procurement side, the DoD contracts, the military installation supply chain, and they had questions that were very specifically calibrated, kind of questions that come from people who already have most of the answer and are looking for the specific piece that connects two things they can see separately but haven't been able to join. Turned out was in the invoice log for March. A billing reference number that appeared in Corvus's Redstone Memorial account also appeared, with a different description, in a DoD procurement filing for medical supplies at a military installation 400 miles away. Same reference number, 2 different destinations, 1 payment. Claire had not known what she was looking at when she logged it in March. She had written it down because it didn't fit, and things that didn't fit went in the notebook. And the notebook was now in the hands of people who knew exactly what it meant. Drennan watched her through most of it from his position at the side of the room. He didn't ask many questions. He mostly listened. At one point, when she was explaining the 6th invoice discrepancy and cross-referencing it against a stockroom count from the same week, caught him looking at her with the expression she had noticed once before, not admiration exactly. Something more functional than that. The look of someone reassessing the dimensions of a situation they thought they had measured. When it was over, Marlowe thanked her. In the direct, non-performative way she seemed to do everything. She stood to leave and then paused at the door. "The nursing board complaint," she said. "We've transmitted a formal federal notice to the board's investigative office this morning. It won't make the complaint disappear, they have their own process, but it establishes the federal record of the circumstances under which the complaint was filed. That matters for the eventual resolution." "I understand," Claire said. "Still going to be slow," Marlowe said. "I won't tell you otherwise." "I know," Claire said. "I've been waiting 8 months already." Something moved briefly across Marlowe's face. Not warmth exactly. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition of one person for another who has been carrying something for a long time without putting it down. Claire drove back to Caldwell in the early afternoon, the sun high and flat, the Nevada landscape doing nothing to soften itself. She stopped once for gas and a sandwich she ate in the parking lot, because she realized mid-pump that she hadn't eaten since the previous night, and her hands had developed a faint tremor that had nothing to do with fear. She got back to her apartment at 2:47 p.m. and slept for 5 hours without dreaming, which was not always the way it went, and she was grateful for it when she woke at 7:50 to 3 texts, 1 voicemail, and a missed call from a number she didn't recognize. First text was from Jolene. "I gave my statement this morning. They had a lot of questions about the hip replacement case. I have the revision timestamps. They wanted everything." The second was from Phil. 3 people came to the floor asking questions today. I logged all of it. Admin is very quiet. Something's happening up there. The third was from a number she didn't have saved, which resolved when she checked the voicemail into the voice of Warren Silk, the compliance attorney from Hargrove's office, speaking in a careful, measured tone that had lost the assurance of his Friday morning register. He said that Hargrove wanted to speak with her at her earliest convenience, that the termination had been formally rescinded, and that there were several personnel matters that required her input to resolve. The missed call was from Drennan. She called him back. "Dana Fowler was formally arrested this afternoon," he said. "Federal charges: healthcare fraud, falsification of medical records, obstruction of a federal audit. There are additional charges being evaluated in connection with the DoD procurement investigation." A pause. She was taken from her home. It wasn't a quiet process. Claire sat on the edge of her bed. "Marcus Hale," she said. "Still in the building when Dana was arrested. He was formally notified that his medical residency has been suspended pending a board investigation. His access to Redstone Memorial's clinical systems was revoked at 3 p.m. Another pause. He's retained an attorney. There's some indication he may be exploring a cooperation agreement, but that's not confirmed. And Alden, she said. Victor Alden was taken into federal custody at 1 p.m. from the Corvus Medical Group offices in Henderson. The arrest was coordinated with the DoD Inspector General's office and the Nevada Attorney General. Drennan's voice was level, but there was something underneath it, the specific quality of a person who has been working toward a point for a long time and has just reached it. The Henderson arrest also produced additional documentation. Physical file at Alden's office. It contains correspondence between Alden and an individual at Redstone Memorial that goes back significantly further than we anticipated. How far back, she said, before you were hired. The apartment was quiet around her. Outside a car passed on the street. Normal sounds. Ordinary evening. He targeted me specifically, she said. It wasn't a question. We believe the credential deletion was not random. Your military background, specifically your service record connected to Colonel Riker's unit, created a liability for the procurement fraud. You had the clearance and the training to recognize certain irregularities that a standard nurse would not have had context for. A pause. Someone identified your application and decided that hiring you, with your full credentials visible, was a risk. The deletion made you easier to manage and easier to remove if necessary. Claire said nothing for a moment. They knew who I was before I walked in the door, she said. That's our current read, yes. She thought about 8 months of supply audits. 8 months of invoice reconciliation, the job Dana had given her because it was low visibility and administrative, the job that kept her away from clinical decisions and out of the documentation system in any meaningful way. The job that had, regardless of the intent behind it, put her in contact with every Corvus invoice that had moved through Redstone Memorial for 8 months. The irony was almost too complete. They put me exactly where I needed to be, she said. In a manner of speaking, Drennan said, yes. The next 10 days moved in the specific rhythms of institutional consequence, which is to say they were not dramatic in the way that the night of the arrests had been dramatic, but they were significant in ways that accumulated. Dana's arraignment was public record. The charges were specific and documented, and the federal complaint was 47 pages long, which meant that anyone who wanted to understand what had happened at Redstone Memorial for the past 3 years could read it. And several people did, including a medical journalist in Las Vegas who filed a story that was picked up by 2 regional outlets and then by a national healthcare publication that ran it under the headline Federal Fraud Case. Exposes years of clinical misconduct at Nevada Hospital. The story didn't name Claire by name. It referred to a staff nurse whose military credentials were deliberately suppressed and a pattern of documentation manipulation affecting at least 41 patient cases. 41 became a number that moved through the hospital with the particular weight of things that cannot be unlearned once they are known. Marcus Hale accepted a cooperation agreement on day 6. The terms were not public, but the outcome was his residency was permanently terminated. His medical board case was opened as a formal proceeding, and his name appeared in the federal complaint in 3 separate sections, each with documented evidence behind it. He left Caldwell before the end of the week. No one from the day shift saw him go. The HR coordinator, who had deleted Claire's credential pages, who had left the hospital 7 months ago with an unexplained payment in her personal account, was located in Phoenix. She retained an attorney, and then, on day 8, stopped retaining an attorney, which meant something had changed in her calculation of what cooperation could offer her. Drennan mentioned this to Claire in a brief phone call without elaborating, which told Claire that the information the coordinator was providing was significant enough that Drennan's team didn't want to characterize it prematurely. Hargrove met with Claire on day 4. It was a different kind of meeting from the previous ones. No Silk, no Dana, no one in the chair to the left. Just Hargrove at her desk with the reading glasses actually on her face this time, and a folder in front of her that she opened and didn't look at, which meant she had read it well enough to know what was in it. Your back pay is being processed, Hargrove said. The suspension of trauma privileges, which were never formally yours to suspend, as it turns out, which is its own documentation problem, has been voided. Your personnel file is being reconstructed with the original 6 pages restored, along with a formal notation of the circumstances of their removal. Thank you, Claire said. Hargrove looked at her. I owe you more than that. What you owe me, Claire said, is the part where this hospital builds something that makes it harder for this to happen to the next person. A documentation audit protocol, an independent channel for nurses to flag clinical discrepancies without going through charge staff. She paused. and a credential verification process that doesn't rely on a single point of access. Hargrove wrote it down. Not in a performative way she wrote it, the way someone writes something they are actually going to do. I'm going to ask you to help design it, Hargrove said. Claire looked at her steadily. Then you'll need to give me a role that has standing to do that. I know, Hargrove said. We're working on the title. On day 9, the Nevada State Board of Nursing formally acknowledged receipt of the federal notice regarding the circumstances of the complaint filed by Marcus Hale. The acknowledgement was not a dismissal. The board's process ran on its own timeline, as Marlowe had said, and it would be months before a formal resolution. But the acknowledgement was public, and it was specific, and it said in plain language that the board was aware the complaint had been filed using information that was the subject of a federal fraud investigation. Claire read the acknowledgement 3 times. Then she filed it in the folder with everything else. On day 10, Colonel Nate Riker called her directly. He was in the rehabilitation facility in Reno, and she could hear the specific institutional background sounds of a medical facility behind his voice, the ambient beep of monitoring equipment, a PA announcement in the middle distance. He sounded better than he had in the TICU, stronger. Still rough, but deliberately so. The way certain people use roughness in their voice as a resource rather than a limitation. Mercer, he said. Colonel, she said. I hear you handed Drennan a notebook. I handed him several things. He said you had invoice discrepancies going back 6 months. In a personal log you kept at home, I did. A pause. You didn't know what you were looking at. Not specifically, she said. I knew it didn't fit. That was enough. Another pause, longer. I want to tell you something. What I said in the TICU that you saved my life twice. There was a third time you don't know about yet. His voice shifted slightly. Not softer, more deliberate. The unit you supported in your second deployment. The engagement in the eastern sector, 2 years before you separated. There were 6 of us in a forward position that got overrun, and the medical response that night kept 4 of us alive long enough to extract. I wasn't there for that engagement, but 2 of the men who walked out are in my command now. They told me who ran the medical response when I started looking into you after the Bay. Claire was quiet. I wasn't looking for that, she said. I know you weren't, he said. That's why it's worth saying. She looked at the window. The Nevada afternoon was flat and pale and unremarkable. How are you sleeping? She asked. Badly, he said. You? Better than I expected, she said. That'll change, he said, not unkindly. When the adrenaline's fully gone. I know, she said. I've been here before. I know you have, he said. And then, with the specific gruffness of someone delivering something they mean, but are not practiced at delivering, you did good, Major. The whole thing, start to finish. You did good. She held the phone for a moment. You were still a difficult patient, she said. She heard something on the other end that might have been a laugh, suppressed before it fully arrived. He ended the call. Corvus Medical Group connection to the Department of Defense procurement case took the shape that Drennan's team had been building toward for 14 months, and which the contents of Alden's physical file had accelerated dramatically. The specific mechanism was a billing structure that routed duplicate payments through a shell company registered in Nevada using reference numbers that appeared in both civilian hospital accounts and DoD supply contracts simultaneously. The shell company had 3 registered officers, one of whom was a name that appeared in military records in connection with 2 supply contracts at installations where Riker's unit had operated. Claire learned this not from Drennan, but from the federal complaint, which was amended on day 11 and became a matter of public record. She read it at her kitchen table with coffee that had gone cold, the same position she had been in many times over the past months, and she read it carefully, because she believed in reading things carefully, regardless of how much she already knew going in. The amended complaint named 6 individuals: Dana Fowler, the HR coordinator from Phoenix, 2 Corvus employees, and a 6th name, a man named Raymond Calder, a former military logistics officer who had separated 3 years ago and moved into private defense contracting, and whose connection to Redstone Memorial was, on the surface, non-existent. Until you read footnote 14 of the amended complaint, which specified that Calder had been a primary financial backer of the credential suppression scheme and had directed Alden to identify and neutralize specific employees whose military backgrounds created discovery risk for the procurement fraud. Calder had identified Claire 9 months ago, before she was hired. He had known about her service record, her connection to units that had operated in the same theaters as his logistics operations, and he had decided, through Alden, through Dana, through an HR coordinator who had needed money and not thought through consequences that the safest version of Claire Mercer inside Redstone Memorial was one who had no documented expertise and no standing to be believed. She set the complaint down on the table. She thought about 8 months of supply audits, of invoice reconciliation, of 3 a.m. shifts in the South stockroom, of being called the supply nurse, specific erosion of standing that happens when an institution treats you consistently as less than you are for long enough that you can feel the pressure of it even when you've decided not to let it touch you. She thought about the notebook, about 43 photographs, about a margin note in March that she had written because something didn't fit, not knowing that it was the thread that would eventually connect a hospital fraud case to a federal procurement investigation involving a man who had built a scheme specifically around the assumption that she would not be believed. Picked up the complaint again. She turned to the page that listed the evidence submissions. Exhibit 31 was her notebook. Exhibit 32 through 74 were her photographs. She read through them, not the photographs themselves, just the descriptions in the index, and she felt something move through her that was not triumph and not satisfaction and not relief, though it had elements of all three. It was closer to the specific feeling of a weight that has been correctly placed, finally, after a long time of being carried wrong. Outside her window, Caldwell looked exactly the same as it always did, and in a federal courthouse 40 miles north at 4:48 p. On a Tuesday in December, Raymond Calder's attorney filed a motion for bail reduction that was denied in 11 minutes because the judge had read the amended complaint, including footnote 14, and had formed a specific and well-documented opinion about flight risk. Claire didn't know about the bail motion. She found out the next morning from Drennan, who called at 7:15 a.m. with his voice carrying that quality she had come to associate with significant developments. Not excited, never excited, but carrying something that had weight in it. The bail motion, he said. I saw it was denied, she said. But in the hearing, Calder's attorney made a statement. On the record, a pause. He said his client had information about the events of November 14th, specifically about the explosion that injured Colonel Riker. His client was prepared to provide a full account in exchange for consideration on the federal charges. Kitchen was quiet. Calder knows what happened to Riker, she said. That's what he's claiming, Drennan said. And if he's telling the truth, if the explosion that injured Riker was not incidental to this case, but connected to it, then what started as a hospital documentation fraud and became a procurement fraud case has just become something that we do not have a clean category for yet. We need you back in Reno, he said. Today, if possible. Claire looked at her coffee. She looked at the amended complaint on the table. I'll leave in an hour, she said. She ended the call. She sat for exactly 30 seconds. Then she picked up the complaint, found Exhibit 31 in the index, and turned to the page where the notebook's contents were described in the formal, flat language of federal documentation. Personal log maintained by subject employee, containing supply discrepancy observations, dated March 4 through November 12. Entries documented in chronological order, with reference numbers, dates, and quantity differentials noted in subject's handwriting. Exhibits 3274 corroborate entries for 9 of the 14 documented discrepancy dates. She read it twice. Then she closed the complaint, put it in her bag, and got ready to drive to Reno. She was almost at the door when her phone vibrated. Text from a number she didn't recognize. You should know they found a second memo in Alden's file. Different recipient, not Dana. The name on it is someone still inside the hospital, someone you see every day. She stared at the text for 4 seconds. Then she read it again, because she had learned a long time ago that the first read of something that changes the shape of a situation was not always the accurate read, that the brain moved faster than comprehension in moments of genuine surprise and filled gaps with assumptions before the actual information had time to settle. The second read said the same thing. Someone you see every day. She put the phone in her bag and got in the car. She drove the first 20 minutes without fully processing the road, which was dangerous, and she knew it. So at the first wide shoulder, she pulled over and sat with the engine running and worked through it the way she worked through everything, not from the emotional center of it, which was pulling hard toward alarm, but from the edges, where the facts were still clean. Text was anonymous. It could be accurate. It could be a disruption tactic designed to destabilize her before the Reno meeting by introducing a variable she couldn't verify. Could be someone inside the investigation leaking information they shouldn't, for reasons she couldn't assess from the outside. Could be all three things simultaneously, which was how these situations usually operated when they reached a certain complexity, not clean categories, but overlapping motives producing the same action from different directions. What she could verify, Drennan had not mentioned a second memo. That absence was either because he didn't know yet, because he knew and had chosen not to tell her, or because the text was fabricated. She would know which when she reached Reno. What she could not afford, walking into the field office building, distracted by a variable she couldn't currently resolve. Pulled back onto the highway, she arrived at 9:44 a.m. And Drennan met her in the lobby again, same gray jacket, and she knew before he spoke that the morning had continued producing things. "We need to talk before we go upstairs," he said. He took her to a side room off the lobby that had two chairs and no windows. She sat the second memo, she said. He looked at her. Something moved briefly across his face. "How anonymous text this morning. I don't know the source." He was quiet for 3 seconds. "We found it at 11 p.m. last night. We've been running the name since then." He put his hands flat on the table. "The recipient of the second memo is Dr. Sylvia Okafor." The room was very still. Claire thought about Okafor in the trauma bay, the way she had stepped forward, the way she had asked, "What do you need?" The way her face had shifted when she looked at the trachea. Thought about the 41 minutes in the TICU with Riker. She thought about every interaction she had had with Okafor over 8 months, which had been infrequent and professionally unremarkable. "What was in the memo?" she said. "Instructions on how to handle the night of November 14th if Riker survived. How to manage the documentation of the trauma bay events. Specifically, how to characterize your intervention in a way that would support the protocol violation complaint." He paused. The memo was sent 3 days before Riker was admitted. Someone knew he was going to be brought to Redstone Memorial that night, which means the explosion wasn't random, Claire said. Calder's attorney made that claim yesterday. The memo corroborates the timeline. He looked at her steadily. "Okafor authorized your intervention. She asked what you needed. Stood beside you when Dana tried to remove you." "I know," Claire said. Either she received the memo and chose not to follow its instructions, or she received it and were misreading her role in all of this, or she received it and reported it, Claire said, to someone. Drennan said nothing. "Did she report it?" Claire said. "She came to us at 6:30 this morning," he said. "Before we contacted her, she brought the memo herself. Physical copy. She also brought documentation of when she received it, how it was delivered, and the conversation she had with Okafor when she was approached about its contents." Claire sat with that. She was being pressured, she said, for at least 3 months before November 14th. The approach was indirect, framed as administrative guidance about managing liability in federal adjacent cases. She said she didn't understand the full scope of what she was being asked to participate in until she was standing in that trauma bay and watching you work. He paused. She said she made the decision to authorize your intervention because you were right about the patient, and because she understood it at that moment that she was being asked to let a man die, to protect a fraud. The room was quiet. "She needs an attorney," Claire said. "She has one. She came with one." He looked at her. "Her cooperation is significant. The memo is direct evidence of premeditation that the events of November 14th were not reactive. They were planned. That changes the criminal exposure of everyone involved substantially." "Calder," Claire said. "And the people above Calder, if there are any," he stood. "And then we need your read on Okafor. You worked with her. What we have on paper tells us one thing. Your read tells us something different. The meeting upstairs lasted 3 hours. Okafor was not in the building. She had given her statement and left, which was protocol. But Reyes walked Claire through the memo, the timeline, and the documentation Okafor had brought in. The memo was 2 pages. It was businesslike and specific in a way that was more disturbing than overt threat would have been. It outlined a post-incident management strategy. It named Claire by name. Characterized her as a potential liability actor whose access to clinical documentation should be minimized following the incident, and outlined steps. The write-up, the protocol violation complaint, the nursing board filing as a sequential plan to be executed in coordination with Dana Fowler. It had been written before Riker was admitted, 3 days before, which meant that whoever had planned the events of November 14th had anticipated that something would go wrong in the trauma bay, had anticipated that Claire might intervene, and had prepared a mechanism to destroy her before she could become a problem. She read it twice in full. "They knew exactly who I was," she said. "Yes," Reyes said. "And they put me on supply rotation specifically to keep me away from clinical decisions and near the invoice system. That's the read. But they didn't know I was already logging the discrepancies, she said. No, Reyes said. They didn't know that. Claire set the memo down on the table. There was something almost architectural about it. The way a plan built to contain her had depended entirely on her being exactly what they had decided she was, and the way it had come apart entirely because she had been something else. Not something dramatic, not something heroic in the constructed sense. Just someone who wrote things down because things that didn't fit went in the notebook, and the notebook went home with her at the end of every shift. The gap between what they had assumed and what she actually was had been the size of a small spiral notebook purchased at a drugstore in Caldwell, Nevada, for $3.49. The rest of December moved in long stretches and sudden compressions, which was how legal processes always moved, and which Claire had prepared herself for, but which was still, in practice, harder than preparation made it. Calder's cooperation agreement negotiations collapsed on December 19th. He had overestimated the value of what he was offering, or his attorney had, and when the DoD Inspector General's office laid out the evidence they already possessed, the negotiating leverage he had been counting on ceased to exist. He was indicted on 7 federal counts the following week, including 1 count of conspiracy in connection with the events of November 14th that carried a sentence exposure that his attorney was not able to soften with any available argument. The arraignment was public. Claire read the coverage on her phone in the Redstone Memorial break room on a Tuesday morning between the end of supply rotation and the start of a trauma floor orientation that Hargrove had asked her to lead. Coverage was factual and thorough and included a photograph of Calder outside the courthouse that caught him in the specific expression of a person who has just understood that the story is no longer one he can manage. She turned her phone over and finished her coffee. Dana Fowler's case moved faster. She had fewer resources for a protracted legal fight, and the federal evidence against her was not ambiguous. She pleaded guilty in January to 3 counts of federal healthcare fraud and 2 counts of falsification of medical records. The plea agreement included full cooperation with the ongoing procurement investigation, which her attorney had negotiated as a sentencing consideration. Her nursing license was submitted for revocation as part of the plea, and the Nevada State Board of Nursing accepted the submissions and made it permanent in February. Permanent meant permanent. She could not reapply. She could not work in clinical care in Nevada or any jurisdiction that recognized the revocation, which was most of them. The sentencing was scheduled for March, and Claire did not attend, not because she was avoiding it, but because she had a shift, and the shift was real, and the work was the thing that had always mattered more than watching the consequence land. She followed the outcome through Drennan's text at 4:17 p. M. Fowler sentenced, 41 months federal, restitution ordered, permanent bar from healthcare employment. She was between patients when the text came through. She read it, put the phone in her pocket, and went back to work. Marcus Hale's cooperation agreement gave him partial protection on the fraud charges in exchange for testimony in Calder's trial and full disclosure on the documentation alterations. His medical residency was terminated. The Nevada State Medical Board opened a formal proceeding that ran for 4 months and concluded with a restricted license he could not practice unsupervised, could not practice in an emergency or trauma context, and was required to complete a 2-year ethics and clinical practice review program before any restriction could be reconsidered. It was not the outcome Claire would have designed, but she had not been asked to design it, and she understood that institutional consequences moved within their own logic and on their own timeline, and that her job was not to determine the outcome, but to make sure the accurate record existed from which the outcome could be determined. That was the thing no one had understood about her from the beginning. Not Hargrove, not Dana, not Marcus, not even Drennan until the diner, and maybe not fully until Reno. She had never been trying to win. She had been trying to make sure the record survived. The distinction mattered. Dr. Sylvia Okafor's situation resolved in a way that was neither clean nor entirely satisfying, which was appropriate because the situation itself had not been clean. She had received the memo. She had not reported it immediately. 3 months of pressure had passed before the night of November 14th gave her a moment that was clear enough to act in. The medical board's review acknowledged the coercive circumstances, while noting that her delayed disclosure had consequences it was not able to ignore. She received a formal reprimand, a 2-year supervised practice requirement, and a documented notation in her professional record. She did not lose her license. Claire thought about that for a long time. Not with resentment Okafor had. In the end, made the right call when it cost her something to do it, which was more than could be said for a lot of people who had been adjacent to this situation and looked away. But she thought about the specific calculus that 3 months of institutional pressure created in a person, the way it accumulated, the way it made the cost of acting feel larger and the cost of not acting feel like simply enduring. Thought about what it would have looked like if Okafor had had a protected pathway to report the pressure the moment she first felt it. A real one, not a theoretical one, not a hotline that routed back to the same administration it was supposed to be independent of, but an actual protected structure with external oversight. She brought it up to Hargrove in February, in one of the twice-monthly meetings that had become a standing item since Claire's new role had been formalized. Her title was Clinical Documentation and Integrity, lead a newly created position, with standing in both the nursing division and the Quality Assurance Office, reporting jointly to Hargrove and to the External Audit Committee that the Board of Directors had established in December as a direct result of the federal case. It was not a position that had existed before. Hargrove had designed it around what Claire had done, not around what an institutional org chart said should exist. That was imperfect, in the way that things built quickly to address a specific failure were always as imperfect. Claire spent the first 6 weeks rewriting the scope to make it durable past her own tenure, because she had learned the hard way that structures built around individual people collapsed when the person left, and the whole point was to build something that didn't depend on her being there forever. Protected reporting pathway, she said to Hargrove in February. External, not routed through administration at any level. A direct line to the Oversight Committee and to the State Health Division. Hargrove looked at the proposal Claire had put on the desk. This is going to take budget justification. I have the Garfield case, the 41 cases, and a federal fraud settlement that cost this hospital considerably more than this pathway will cost, Claire said. I can write the justification. I know you can, Hargrove said. It's not the problem. The problem is the board needs to vote it, and 3 of the 7 board members are still processing the fact that they didn't catch this themselves. Then give them something to vote for instead of something to vote against, Claire said. Frame it as the hospital taking a leading position on clinical documentation integrity. It's a national conversation right now. The federal case put Redstone Memorial in the middle of it, whether the board wanted that or not. They can be the hospital that was exposed, or they can be the hospital that built something better because of it. Hargrove looked at her. You should have been in administration 8 months ago, she said. I should have been in trauma, Claire said. But here we are. Proposal passed in March with a 5-2 board vote. The Nevada State Board of Nursing issued its formal determination on Claire's case on March 11th, 14 weeks after the federal notice had flagged the complaint's origins. The determination was 63 pages long, which was more than the situation required, but which reflected the board's need to establish a complete record given the federal case's profile. Complaint filed by Marcus Hale was dismissed in its entirety. The determination found that the complaint had been filed using knowingly misrepresented information, that the characterization of Claire's intervention as unauthorized was contradicted by Dr. Okafor's documented verbal authorization, and that the procedural steps taken in the trauma bay on November 14th were consistent with the clinical training and background that Claire's full credentials, now restored in her personnel file, established. The determination also included a provision that Claire had not anticipated, a formal commendation notation appended to her Nevada nursing license, recognizing the clinical decision-making in the Riker case as an example of appropriate emergency intervention under suboptimal authorization conditions. The language was careful and bureaucratic, as board language always was, but the notation was real, and it was permanent, and it would appear on her license record for every future employer, every credential verification, every professional context in which her record was reviewed. She read it at her kitchen table, same chair, the morning light coming through the window at the same angle it always did. She did not cry, which she might have expected of herself, and which didn't happen, because the feeling it produced was not the kind that moved toward tears. Quieter than that. The specific release of something that has been held at tension for a long time, not explosive. Just the slow return to a natural state, like a cable going slack after the load has been removed. She photographed the determination with her phone. Folder. The military commendation ceremony was held on a Thursday afternoon in April at a federal facility outside Reno that was not large enough to make the event feel staged. Colonel Nate Riker was there, out of the rehabilitation facility, and standing under his own power, though Claire noticed he was favoring his left side, in a way he was trying not to make visible and largely failing at. There were maybe 30 people in the room. Drennan was there. Reyes, Marlowe, who had driven from Las Vegas, and who shook Claire's hand before the ceremony with the same direct, non-performative grip as the first time. Hargrove had asked if she could attend, and Claire had said yes. And Hargrove sat in the third row in civilian clothes, looking like someone who was present out of genuine obligation, rather than institutional performance, which was a distinction Claire had learned to read accurately. Jolene was there. She had driven from Caldwell and arrived 12 minutes early and sat in the second row and didn't say much before the ceremony, which was the correct thing. Phil Osees had been invited and had sent a handwritten note saying he had a shift and would rather be at the hospital doing his job, and that he thought Claire would understand. She did. Riker gave a short speech that was not sentimental and not brief enough. By his own assessment, he said, partway through, "I'm going to wrap this up because I know she'd rather I didn't talk for 20 minutes about her," which produced a laugh from the room that was genuine. He covered the night of November 14th in 2 sentences. He covered what the investigation had revealed in 3. And then he said something that was not in any speech format Claire would have anticipated from him. The thing about the people who tried to erase her record is that they understood something true. They understood that her record was dangerous to them. They just didn't understand that you can't actually erase someone's record by deleting the pages. You can only erase it if the person lets you. And she didn't let them. He pinned the commendation. She shook his hand. He looked at her. "You still owe me a better beside manner," he said quietly enough that only she could hear. "You're a better patient than you used to be," she said. Marginally, something moved at the corner of his mouth. The room applauded. Afterward, in the parking lot, Drennan found her before she reached her car. "The Garfield family," he said. "They've been notified about the record, about what the investigation found. Their attorney reached out this week." "I know," she said. "They want to talk to me." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to. He was my patient in the way that all of them were my patient, even the ones I was never assigned to. That's how it worked." She paused. "He deserved better than what he got. The least I can do is look his family in the eye and tell them what I saw and what I did with it." Drennan nodded. "Calder's trial starts in May," he said. "I know. It's going to be public. More coverage than the fraud case. I know that too." He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of directness, not warm exactly, but genuine. "You know what I kept thinking about after the diner? After you handed me the notebook?" "No," she said. "I kept thinking that if they had just left you alone, if they'd processed your application correctly, if your credentials had been in your file where they belonged, you would have been on trauma rotation from day one. You would have been working with the experienced physicians, getting the assignments that matched your background. You would never have been on supply rotation. You would never have been reconciling invoices." He paused. The whole fraud might have run another 3 years before anyone caught it. Claire looked at the parking lot. The afternoon light was warm for April. The specific warmth that came before the Nevada summer settled in and became something harsher. "They were very thorough," she said. "Except for the part where they handed me the one job in the hospital that put me in contact with every invoice they were running." "Yeah," Drennan said. "Except for that." She opened her car door. "Thank you," she said, "for taking the meeting at Marta's. You drove 90 minutes to hand me a notebook and 43 photographs," he said. "The least I could do." She got in the car. The thing about the work Claire did in the following months was that it was not visible in the way the preceding months had been visible. There was no drama in building a documentation audit protocol. There was no cinematic tension in writing some procedural language for an independent reporting pathway. There was no moment of recognition in the hours she spent with Hargrove's legal team constructing the credential verification framework that would require 2 independent confirmations for any personnel file modification going forward. It was paper and process in committee meetings, and the specific patience of someone who has decided that the structure matters more than the speed. She sat in those meetings, and she argued for the specific things she knew mattered from specific experiences. And sometimes the committee agreed, and sometimes they didn't. And she revised the proposal and came back, because that was how institutional change actually worked. Not in a single decisive moment, but in the grinding accumulation of argued and re-argued positions, until the thing that needed to exist finally existed in a form that would survive after you stopped pushing it. She was not always patient. She lost her temper in one meeting in June, a board subcommittee discussion about the cost of external credential verification, and said things that were accurate and necessary and not delivered in the most effective register. She thought about it afterward and acknowledged it without performing remorse about it. She had been right about the substance. She had been less effective than she wanted to be about the delivery. Those were both true simultaneously, and she carried them both without resolving one by dismissing the other. She was also still a floor nurse 3 nights a week, because she had insisted on keeping the clinical hours as condition of the administrative role, and because the floor was where the work was real, in the way that committee meetings were not. Took her supply rotation when Phil put her on it, and her trauma assists when they were needed, and she worked alongside nurses who had not known her 8 months ago and would not have recognized her from the institutional story, that had moved through Redstone Memorial like weather. Most of them just knew her as the nurse who had the new administrative role and still showed up for overnight shifts and never talked about herself unless someone asked directly. Suited her. In July, 7 months after the night everything started, Jolene Park filed a formal report through the new independent pathway about a medication documentation discrepancy she had observed on the day shift. The report was processed in 48 hours. The discrepancy was reviewed. The attending involved was contacted, and a correction was made. No one was fired. No one was disciplined beyond a formal notation and a mandatory documentation review session. But the report existed. It was processed. It produced a result. Jolene told Claire about it over coffee in the break room on a Thursday between shifts, in the low-key way of someone reporting a thing they expected would be unremarkable, but which felt, in the telling, larger than they'd anticipated. It actually worked, Jolene said. That's the point, Claire said. I know. Jolene looked at her coffee. For 3 years, I saw things and didn't say anything because I didn't think it would go anywhere. And this one thing, I reported it. And 48 hours later, someone actually looked at it. And now you know that, Claire said. And so does anyone you tell. Jolene was quiet for a moment. I told 2 nurses on day shift already, she said. Good, Claire said. The last thing happened in August. Bernard Garfield's daughter was named Nora Garfield, and she was 53, and had driven from Sacramento specifically to meet Claire, which Claire had known was coming, and which she had still not fully prepared herself for, because there was no complete preparation for this kind of meeting. They sat in a conference room at the hospital, not Hargrove's office, a neutral room, smaller, and Nora Garfield had a folder in front of her that she didn't open for the first 10 minutes, which were the 10 minutes where Claire told her everything she could tell her about her father's case, the original chart entry, the flag she had raised, what had happened after. Nora listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, Nora was quiet for a moment. He was in the hospital for 8 days, she said, for the second admission. We kept calling, and they kept saying he was fine, that the clearance meant he was fine. She looked at the table. Kept thinking I have a college degree. I work in insurance. I understand systems. Still couldn't get anyone to listen. I know, Claire said. Tried, Nora said. I tried at the point I had access, Claire said. I should have pushed harder at the right moment, and I didn't because I was operating inside a system that I knew would use it against me. That's a real thing that happened. It doesn't make me more responsible than the people who altered the chart. But it's the part that belongs to me, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. Nora looked at her. That's the first honest thing anyone from this hospital has said to me, she said. Not angrily, flatly, with the specific flatness of someone who has been receiving managed language for a long time. They sat with that. What happens now? Nora said. For him. For the record. The federal case establishes the documented record of what happened. Permanent. The civil case your attorney filed against the hospital will resolve through that record. Your father's discharge was altered by someone who has pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges. That's in the record forever. Claire looked at her steadily. Can't give him back. I can't make what happened to your family smaller. What I can tell you is that his case is the reason this hospital built something different. The pathway Jolene used in July exists because of him. The verification protocol exists because of him. Every patient who doesn't lose their record in this building from here forward, that's because of your father and what his case revealed. Nora Garfield opened her folder. Inside was a photograph. A man in his 60s, outdoors somewhere green, laughing at something outside the frame. She set it on the table between them. His name was Bernard, she said. He coached Little League for 22 years. He made terrible puns. He called me every Sunday morning at 8 o'clock and talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. She looked at the photograph. He deserved better. He did, Claire said. They sat together for another half hour. They didn't resolve anything that couldn't have been said in the first 10 minutes. But they sat together anyway, because that was the other part of the work, the part that didn't have a procedural name and didn't fit in a documentation framework and could not be systematized or streamlined or made more efficient without becoming something else entirely. When Nora left, she shook Claire's hand at the door. He would have liked you, she said. I hope so, Claire said. That evening, Claire drove home in the August heat and sat at her kitchen table and did not think about the commendation or the board vote or the federal charges or the 43 photographs or any of the things that had constituted the preceding 9 months of her life. She thought about Nora Garfield's photograph, a man laughing at something outside the frame. She thought about the fact that the system that had killed him was built from ordinary decisions made by ordinary people who had decided, gradually and then completely, that the record didn't matter as long as their version of it survived. Not monsters, not masterminds. People who had wanted things money, status, safety, control, and had decided the record was an obstacle rather than the point. And she thought about the other thing, the thing she had never said out loud to Drennan, or Marlowe, or Riker, or Hargrove, the thing she had kept for herself through all of it, because some things were not for institutional consumption. The reason she had kept the notebook. The reason she had taken 43 photographs. The reason she had documented the sequence of the trauma bay at 1:17 and when she could have gone home and let it go. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't even discipline, not exactly. It was the understanding, formed in places and circumstances that had no equivalent in this hospital or any hospital, that the record was the only thing that persisted after you were gone, not the version of you that institutions preferred, not the version that was useful to the people who needed you to be smaller than you were. The actual record, what you did, what you saw, what you knew, and when you knew it, and what you did with the knowledge. That was the thing they had tried to erase, and the thing they had failed to erase, not because she was exceptional, but because she had refused to stop believing it mattered. She was not always certain she was right about things. She was not always patient or measured or effective. She had made clinical calls that she second-guessed afterward. She had said things in committee meetings that she wished she had said differently. She was 30 years old and tired, and still occasionally woke at 3 with the specific disorientation of someone who has carried a particular weight for long enough that the absence of it is itself a kind of vertigo. None of that was resolved. None of it was neatly concluded. The record existed. Nora Garfield's father had a record that told the truth about what happened to him. The nurses who would come to Redstone Memorial next year and the year after had a pathway that didn't route through the people with reasons to ignore them. And somewhere in a federal prison outside Nevada, 3 people who had built a system on the assumption that a quiet woman on supply rotation would stay against the wall were living with the specific consequence of having been wrong about that. Claire picked up her coffee mug and found it empty. She got up and made more. She had a shift tomorrow. The work didn't pause. It never had. That was the thing she had learned. In 8 months of 3 M stockrooms and invoice discrepancies and anonymous texts and federal field offices, the work was not heroic. The work was the work. You did it accurately. You documented it honestly. And when the system tried to make you smaller than you were, you did not make yourself larger in response. You simply refused to shrink. You stayed. You wrote it down. You let the record be what it was. And eventually, not quickly, not easily, not without cost, the record became impossible to erase.